Hey, sleepy listener. Welcome to Sleeping Podcast. Where in the world are you listening from? Let us know in the comments. And if you're ready to drift off, like and subscribe. And let's begin. Let me tell you about the night I found myself by the ocean, just as the day was exhaling its last golden breath. The light hung low on the horizon, softened and warm, as though it had passed through layers of silk before reaching my eyes. Everything carried a hush. Not silence exactly, but a kind of tender stillness that seemed to ask nothing from me except to notice it. The shoreline village behind me had already grown quiet. Wooden shutters were drawn halfway closed, and the scent of warm bread and cooling hearthstones drifted faintly through the air. Somewhere far off, a gull called out, its voice stretched and lazy, as though even it had surrendered to the evening's slower pace. A thin breeze wandered through, carrying with it the salt of the sea and the dry, smoky perfume of old driftwood washed clean by years of tides. I stood there for a moment, letting the world settle around me, feeling the quiet press of the air against my skin. The ocean's rhythm was steady, unhurried, each wave arriving like the slow heartbeat of something vast and ancient. The sound was neither loud nor soft, but full in a way that made it seem to come from everywhere at once. It filled the spaces between my thoughts until there were no edges left in my mind, only a smooth, open expanse. My breath began to match that rhythm without my asking it to. Slow in, slow out, as though I had borrowed the ocean's lungs. I let my shoulders drop and felt the weight I had been carrying all day slip somewhere behind me. When I began to walk, the sand gave way under my feet with a cool, silken texture. It cradled each step, holding me for a moment before letting me go. Tiny grains clung to my skin, catching the last threads of light so that they shimmered faintly when I looked down. The tide was still some distance away, its reach marked by a smooth band of darker sand, glistening faintly where the water had retreated. Far out, the horizon glowed like a line of softly burning embers, fading upward into shades of peach, then rose, then the dusky lavender of night in its first breath. The sky was vast and tender, a dome of color that seemed to bend closer with each passing moment. The first stars were beginning to appear, shy pinpricks of silver against the deepening blue, and I found myself slowing even more, as though I didn't want to disturb their quiet arrival. Each inhale brought with it a little more of the sea, that unmistakable scent that is part mineral, part wind, and part memory. It carried the cool dampness of places the sun had not touched for hours, mingled with something faintly sweet, like the breath of distant flowers. I passed a patch of seagrass growing in a low dune, their slender blades bending with the wind, as if they were whispering to one another. The sound they made was dry and delicate, a small counterpoint to the broad, rounded tones of the tide. Together, they created a kind of music I could feel in my chest, one low and deep, the other high and whisper thin, weaving around each other in perfect agreement. Every so often, the soft grit of my footsteps joined that music, then faded as I paused to take in the changing light. There was no need to hurry. In this place, time seemed to unfold not in minutes, but in breaths, each one carrying me deeper into the gentle fabric of the night. The village lights behind me began to flicker on, one by one, like fireflies finding their place in the dark. They shone softly against the worn wood of cottages, their glow blurred by the salt in the air. I thought of how many evenings must have passed here in just this way. Light yielding to dark, the ocean whispering its patient song, the air wrapping itself in a cooler touch. The thought made me feel both very small and entirely safe, as though I had stepped into a story that had been told for centuries. My bare feet began to find the cooler, wetter sand near the water's reach. Here, the surface was smooth, shining faintly under the dimming sky, each step pressing out a pale halo of moisture before settling back into place. I watched the prints trail away behind me until they blurred into the tide's patient edge. The first full breath of night was settling in now. Overhead, more stars were blooming, each one a tiny beacon in the widening darkness. The air had taken on a sharper freshness, and with it came a deeper quiet, the kind that feels almost like a blanket drawn close. My breathing matched it, slow and steady, each exhale a little longer than the last, each inhale filled with the ocean's endless calm. It was then that I felt the weight of the day dissolve completely, as though it had been carried out to sea with the receding tide. What remained was only the soft pulse of the earth beneath me, the shimmer of the sky above, and the deep, unhurried breath of water moving toward and away, a conversation that had been going on long before I arrived and would continue long after I had gone. I walked a little farther, then paused, letting my gaze rest on the line where sea met sky. It was no longer a sharp divide, but a seamless blend of shadowed blue and silver light, each folding into the other without haste. Standing there, I felt as though I had stepped to the very edge of something. Not an end, but a vast, open stillness where all things slowed into rest. The night, in its quiet generosity, seemed to welcome me there. And so I stayed, breathing with the ocean, letting its heartbeat become my own. The sand here was finer than I remembered, a soft, damp powder that yielded easily beneath my bare feet. Each step pressed it into smooth hollows, the edges of my footprints blurring almost immediately as the faintest breeze skimmed the surface. There was a coolness to it, not the chill of stone or metal, but the gentle, even cool of something that had spent the day storing warmth and was now slowly letting it go. When I lifted my foot, a pale trace remained for a moment, then faded into the even tone of the shore. The air had grown deeper in color, the brightness of day dissolving into a palette of indigo and violet. The sea mirrored it perfectly, the waves no longer shining with gold, but darkening into rich, shifting hues that seemed to drink the last light from the sky. Each crest caught a faint gleam, a silver line that appeared and disappeared in the slow rise and fall of water. It was as though the ocean itself had decided to rest, speaking in a softer voice now, each wave breaking with a sigh instead of a roar. I walked without direction, letting the shoreline curve as it wished, my steps adjusting to its rhythm. The tide's edge left a thin, glistening sheen over the sand, so that in places it seemed the ground was made of glass. This fragile layer reflected the deepening sky above me, holding a miniature, upside-down version of the evening's colors at my feet. Every so often, a small shell caught the fading light, an oval gleam of ivory, a spiral with faint pink shadows, a fragment worn smooth as satin. I stopped for each one, not to take it, but simply to see it. My fingers brushed lightly over their surfaces, tracing the ridges and curves, feeling the tiny grainy film of sand that clung to them. These shells, I thought, had once been homes, then boats for the smallest travelers, then treasures delivered to shore by the patient tide. Now they lay here, waiting only to be noticed before the next wave claimed them again. The ocean's scent was more present now, rising from the damp sand in a mingling of salt, water, and something faintly metallic, like the breath of deep stones. I inhaled it slowly, letting it settle into me, until I could almost imagine it was part of my own breath. Far ahead, the shore was empty. The village lights were hidden now, behind the dunes, and there was nothing but the widening night and the sound of the water drawing in and falling away. The horizon had softened, its line blurred, as the colors of sea and sky deepened into one another. I kept walking, my pace steady but unhurried, listening to the way my steps and the tide wove together into a single sound. Here and there, the foam of the waves lingered after the water withdrew, folding into itself like lace. I watched how it thinned and flattened, breaking apart into delicate bubbles before disappearing altogether. My mind moved in the same way, gathering thoughts, then letting them dissolve. Ideas rose briefly, then drifted apart before they could form into anything sharp or demanding. I found myself breathing more deeply, each inhale pulling in the coolness of the air and the distant warmth still clinging to the sea. My shoulders swayed slightly with the movement of my steps, as though I had given in entirely to the slow dance of shore and water. Above me, the first true night colors settled into place. The violet darkened to a dusky blue, and the indigo of the ocean deepened until it was almost black. Yet it was never entirely dark. There was always some light, caught in the wave crests, in the shine of wet sand, in the faint glow that clung to the air just above the horizon. I looked down again, and a particularly small shell drew my attention. No bigger than the tip of my thumb, its surface ridged with perfect symmetry. The light touched it just enough to reveal its pattern, like the delicate lines of a fingerprint. I imagined how far it might have traveled, before arriving here. How many tides had lifted and set it down. I left it in place, knowing the sea would decide its next journey. Somewhere behind me, the waves shifted slightly, a change so small it was more felt than heard, as though the ocean had taken a deeper breath. The air moved gently across my skin, cool and damp, and I let it pass through me as easily as wind through grass. With each step, the shore seemed to stretch farther into the quiet. My thoughts wandered without urgency, drifting from the sight of the shells to the sound of the waves, to the way the sand held the imprint of my feet for a moment and then forgot them. There was no need to hold on to anything here. Everything flowed, came and went, returned again in its own time. The foam traced delicate borders at the water's edge, curling around my toes when the tide reached a little farther. I paused there, feeling the gentle pull as it slipped away, leaving the sand smooth and cool again. The sensation was like a promise that the water would always return, always arrive to touch the shore once more. I walked on, and the night continued to unfold above me. Each star, a quiet lantern, placed carefully in its place. The sea held their reflection in fragments, each one breaking and reforming with the movement of the tide. My eyes moved between them, unable to tell where the sky ended and the ocean began. The sand beneath me was constant, its damp firmness supporting my steps, its fine grains shifting just enough to remind me that nothing in this place was truly still. Even in quiet, there was movement, a rhythm too gentle to disturb, but always present, always guiding me forward. My mind drifted again, wandering along with the tide foam, letting thoughts form and fade without resistance. There was no beginning or end to them, only a gentle looping, like waves folding into the shore, again and again, under the dimming sky. I came upon a long, pale driftwood log, resting just above the reach of the tide, its surface worn smooth by years of salt and sun. It looked as though it had been placed there deliberately, waiting for me, and so I lowered myself onto it, feeling the cool, faintly rough grain beneath my palms. The wood held the last of the day's warmth in its core, a quiet heat that rose slowly into my skin. From here, the view of the water was unobstructed, a wide, breathing expanse stretching toward the horizon. I let my feet rest in the damp sand, toes curling slightly into its soft coolness, and leaned forward, elbows on my knees, listening. The tide's voice was steady, patient. Each wave moved toward the shore with a fullness that never hurried, breaking into a low, rolling crest before falling into a sigh. There was a pause then, brief but spacious, before the water slicked back, the sound thinning into a faint hiss as it sifted through the sand and shells. That rhythm repeated again and again, so even, so certain, that I began to feel it as much as hear it, like the sway of a cradle or the long, deep breath of someone already sleeping. I closed my eyes and let the sounds wrap around me. The crests were soft bursts of energy. The hush after each one was a settling, like a blanket being drawn closer around the shoulders. Then came the retreat, a quieter voice, bubbling and slipping away before the stillness of the pause. A moment when the sea seemed to draw in upon itself, gathering breath for the next arrival. Sometimes the waves came a little stronger, the crest a little higher, and the retreat a little longer. Other times, they moved with almost no urgency at all, so that the change between water's presence and absence was hardly noticeable. Yet, there was never a break in the pattern. It was a conversation without words, without an ending, spoken in the same language for longer than I could imagine. I let my breathing fall in time with it, in with the swell, out with the retreat. My chest rose and fell in the same slow cadence until I could no longer tell if I was following the ocean or if it was following me. The air felt cool and round as it filled me, then warm and weightless as it left, carrying away what little restlessness I still held. Opening my eyes again, I watched how the water darkened further under the sky's deepening indigo. The silver glints from earlier had grown softer, more diffused, as though the light itself had learned to whisper. The line of foam that marked each wave's arrival curved along the shore like the hem of a flowing garment, always shifting, yet always familiar. I thought of how many shores these waters had touched, how the same ocean that lay before me had brushed the edges of distant lands, whispered against rocks I had never seen, smoothed sand under skies I would never stand beneath. Somewhere, far beyond my sight, these waves might be falling in another night, in another quiet place, where someone else listened as I did now. The thought filled me with a sense of vast connection, as if the tide itself were a thread running through every coastline, stitching them together with each patient rise and fall. The driftwood beneath me felt steady, rooted despite its journey here. It had likely floated for months or years before finding rest on this shore, carrying the marks of countless tides, sunlit days, and starlit nights. I imagined it tumbling in the surf, turning slowly in the water, the sound of the waves its only companion until it settled here to keep watch over this stretch of sand. The tide's murmur continued, weaving around my thoughts. Crest, hush, retreat, pause. The sequence was so deeply even that it felt as though time itself had slowed to match it. In that rhythm, there was no past and no future. Only the gentle arrival, the quiet settling, and the soft departure. Over and over, a breeze moved over the water, folding into the sound, adding a faint thread of rustling to the tide's voice. It was the kind of sound that asks nothing. It simply exists, an offering of presence. The air carried the faint tang of salt and the cool dampness of far-off currents. I breathed it in as if it were a gift, letting it settle deep within me. The longer I listened, the more I began to notice the subtle differences in each wave's song. Some arrived with a faint bubbling undercurrent, others with a soft rush, as though brushing over pebbles hidden beneath the surface. Sometimes the retreat was swift and smooth. Other times it lingered, pulling gently at the shore, as if reluctant to leave. These variations made the rhythm feel alive, a breathing thing that shifted slightly with each cycle, but never broke its flow. Above the water, the sky's darkness had thickened, and stars were gathering in greater numbers now. Their reflections scattered across the surface, like coins tossed into a deep well. Each wave caught a different fragment of light, holding it for a heartbeat before releasing it into the next swell. I stayed on the driftwood, still and content, the tide's murmur washing through me in slow, even pulses. I thought of the way water shapes everything it touches, not with force alone, but with persistence, with the quiet certainty of its presence. Over years, decades, centuries, its smooth stone carries sand, reshapes entire shores, always in rhythm, never in haste. The idea settled into me like a soft weight, that perhaps life too is shaped in this way, not in sudden sharp changes, but in the patient return of something gentle, steady, and sure. The tide, in its endless repetition, seemed to know this truth. I leaned back slightly, placing my hands on the driftwood for balance, and let the sound carry me. The waves moved on, each one a new arrival, yet part of a whole, without beginning or end. In their presence, my thoughts loosened completely, drifting like small boats unmoored, floating wherever the water chose to take them. And so I sat, the low murmur of the tide filling the night, a voice that had spoken for as long as there had been shores to hear it, and would go on speaking long after I rose and walked away. Far out on the darkening water, I began to notice small points of light, faint at first, as though they were only imagined, then steady, bobbing gently with the slow lift of the sea. They were the lanterns of fishing boats, scattered across the horizon in no clear pattern, each one rocking with its own rhythm. The distance between them made the night feel vast, yet each glow was like a quiet anchor in the expanse, proof of presence in all that darkness. The lights swayed as the boats rose and dipped, a kind of slow breathing, visible from shore. I found myself picturing the decks beneath them, the worn wooden boards, damp with sea spray, the faint creak of ropes shifting, the occasional sound of water slapping gently against the hull. I imagined the sailors there moving softly, their voices low, speaking in the kind of murmurs that carry only a short distance before the night swallows them. There would be no rush in those words, no urgency, just simple exchanges to pass the hours while the nets waited below. In my mind, I could almost see them, faces lined from years of salt air, eyes narrowed, not in strain, but in quiet habit, hands working without need for thought. Perhaps one of them leaned against the railing, watching the water as I did now, letting his gaze follow the dark shapes of the waves. Another might be adjusting a lantern's wick. Somewhere, Someone might even be stifling a yawn, the slow heaviness of night settling into their limbs. The lanterns themselves seemed to drift closer to the stars as I watched, as if the sea were lifting them upward to meet the sky. Their golden glow was warm against the cool indigo all around, and I found myself comparing them to the stars overhead. There was a kinship between them, both small lights against a great darkness, both steady yet moving in their own slow ways. The stars drifted across the sky's arc, the lanterns across the slow roll of the sea. Each reflected something of the other, so that for a moment, I couldn't tell where the horizon truly lay. I thought of how, from the deck of those boats, the shore's lights must appear just as distant, just as small and steady. Perhaps someone out there was looking toward land, seeing the faint glimmer of windows or street lamps, imagining the quiet lives moving beneath them. And maybe, though they could not see me here on this driftwood log, they knew someone was on shore, watching their lights in return. The thought drew a quiet sense of connection between us, invisible but present, stretched thin over miles of open water. The night air wrapped itself more closely around me, cool but not unfriendly. I pulled my knees closer to my chest, resting my chin there for a while, and let my gaze rest on those faraway lights. They bobbed in and out of alignment with one another, the waves shifting their positions in a slow, unending dance. Sometimes a lantern would vanish for a few moments behind the swell, only to reappear, steady as before. Each time it came back, it felt like a reassurance, a soft reminder that even when something disappears from view, it still exists, moving in its own quiet way. The sea between us was dark, its surface occasionally catching a shard of starlight or a fleeting silver curve from the moon's reflection. Those brief touches of brightness felt like passing signals, small acknowledgments between water and light. In that openness, the presence of the lanterns seemed even more comforting, like familiar faces in a crowd of shadows. I imagined the scent on those boats, the sharper salt of the open water, the faint oil from the lanterns, maybe the lingering smell of fish and nets drying in the air. I could almost hear the slow clink of metal hooks, the gentle splash of a line being drawn in, the rustle of heavy fabric as someone shifted their weight. But above all, I imagined the quiet, the same quiet I felt here, stretching around them, filling the space between the boats, the nets, the thoughts of the sailors themselves. The more I looked, the more I felt that those lanterns were not only for the work of the night, but also for one another. Lights that said, "I am here," to the next boat across the water. And perhaps that was why I found them so calming. They reminded me that even in the middle of this vast, dark space, we are never entirely alone. I leaned back slightly, resting my palms against the driftwood, and tilted my head toward the stars. The sky was rich now, scattered with 1,000 tiny fires. Some shone sharp and white, others faint and hazy, like brushstrokes barely visible against the canvas of night. Between them, the dark was deep and endless, yet it didn't feel empty. The stars, like the lanterns, gave it shape. A soft constellation above, another floating gently on the sea below. As I breathed in, I felt the cool air settle into my lungs, carrying the faintest trace of salt. My exhale was slow, almost soundless. Drifting in the presence of those distant boats seemed to steady me further, their patient bobbing matching the unhurried lift and fall of my breath. I thought again of the sailors, how they might be leaning against the side of their boats, looking out over the same stretch of water, each wrapped in their own thoughts, but sharing the same night. Even if none of us knew each other's names, we were joined by the same horizon, the same moonlight, the same steady pull of the tide beneath us. That knowledge settled in me like warmth, spreading gently outward, until the night no longer felt like an expanse to cross, but a shared space to rest within. The lanterns swayed, the stars shimmered, and the ocean held us all in its quiet embrace. Somewhere far out there, others were awake with me. And here, with the sound of the waves and the soft glow of those distant lights, I felt as though the night itself was watching over us all. The sand began to slope upward in a gentle rise, leading me toward a narrow path that traced the place where the beach met the low dunes. Here, the ground was firmer, the surface a mix of fine sand and scattered shells, pressed smooth by the quiet passage of wind. The tide's voice softened behind me, still present, but now cushioned by the small rise between water and path. Ahead, the way curved lightly, as though inviting me to follow without haste. On either side, tall dune grass swayed in the ocean breeze, their movements slow and deliberate. Each blade bent and lifted with a grace that felt almost choreographed, as though they were dancers in some quiet performance meant only for the moon and the stars. The wind moved through them like music, low and whispering, carrying faint changes in pitch as it passed through the varying heights. When I slowed my steps, I could hear the subtle rasp of their slender leaves brushing against one another, a sound as soft as the turning of pages in an old book. The grass caught the moonlight in thin silver lines, each stem tipped with a pale, feathery plume that shimmered when the wind turned it just so. Beneath their swaying, small shadows formed and dissolved, shifting with the rhythm of the breeze. There was something deeply calming in their persistence, rooted in place, yet always in motion. Each sway, a reminder of the ocean's reach, even here, beyond the shore's edge. The air carried a change as I moved farther along the path, a new scent slipping in with the salt and faint tang of seaweed. It was subtle at first, almost hidden beneath the freshness of the night. But the longer I walked, the more I noticed it. The soft, velvety fragrance of flowers blooming somewhere nearby. I slowed. It was not the sharp perfume of day-blooming blossoms, but something gentler, more reserved, as though it belonged only to this hour, this hush. The flowers themselves were not immediately visible, their shapes concealed among the grass and low dune plants. But I felt their presence in the air, each breath carrying a thread of sweetness. It was a fragrance that did not demand attention, only rewarded it when noticed. The way moonlight rewards the eye that takes time to see its subtler shades. I let my hands brush against the taller grass at the path's edge as I walked, feeling the cool smoothness of the stalks give way to the delicate texture of the feathery tips. The contact left a faint tickle against my skin, a reminder of the living quiet that surrounded me. Somewhere overhead, the wind shifted, and the blades leaned together, bending toward me before slowly parting again, as if in greeting. The rhythm of my steps and the sway of the grass began to blend in my mind, a slow, even pulse that seemed to match the distant breathing of the ocean. Without noticing it at first, I found a faint sound rising in my own throat, a low hum, steady and soft, more a vibration than a melody. It was not a tune I recognized, but it seemed to belong here, born from the mingling of breeze, tide, and quiet earth beneath my feet. The sound felt as though it came from deep in my chest, unforced and unhurried, flowing out into the night air. It wrapped itself gently around me, mingling with the rustle of grass and the occasional sigh of wind. I let it continue without thought, the hum shifting slightly as I walked, sometimes deepening, sometimes lightening, always keeping its place within the surrounding stillness. The moon followed me along the path, casting the grass into long, soft-edged shadows that lay across my way. Where the grass thinned, the sand appeared pale and luminous, as though holding a memory of daylight within its grains. My feet sank lightly into it, each step leaving a shallow mark before the breeze began its slow work of smoothing it away. From somewhere up the path, I heard a faint click, perhaps the sound of two shells tapping together in the grass, carried on the wind. It was gone as quickly as it came, folded back into the quiet murmur of the night. The hum in my chest adapted to it, as though acknowledging its brief entrance into the music of the moment. Now and then, I caught glimpses of the ocean again through breaks in the dunes, narrow views of the moonlit water shifting gently, its surface restless but never hurried. Each glimpse was like a pause between breaths, a reminder of the vast calm just beyond the rise. Between those openings, I let the grass take my attention again, following the patterns of its movement, the way one clump leaned toward another, only for both to drift apart and meet again in the next breath of wind. The fragrance of the unseen flowers grew slightly stronger as I continued, mingling with the salt air until the two were inseparable. Breathing it in felt like sinking into a softer layer of the night, one where sound, scent, and touch blurred into one another. I thought of how these flowers opened only when the light faded, offering themselves to the cool air and the moon's gaze, unseen by the day, but fully alive in the dark. The hum in my voice became slower, quieter, until it was more a whisper of vibration than a sound. I wasn't sure if I was still making it for my own sake, or for the grass and flowers around me. a small offering to the path that had guided me here. My steps slowed to match it, unhurried, deliberate, each one placing me more fully into the ease of the night. The path curved gently again, leading me deeper between the dunes, and I followed without thinking, the sway of the grass and the faint perfume of flowers keeping me company. Behind me, the tide's voice was now only a low murmur, as though it had grown content to watch from a distance, while I walked on beneath the moon. Ahead, the narrow way seemed to invite me onward. Each turn, the moon had been climbing quietly for some time, though I had not noticed the moment it broke free of the horizon. Now it hovered well above the water, round and luminous, pouring its silver light across the sea, as though unrolling a long, shimmering path. The waves, once a deep wash of shadow, now gleamed with shifting light, their crests catching it like edges of liquid glass before folding gently back into the darker troughs. It was not a light that demanded attention, but one that seemed to welcome it. Soft, unblinking, patient. The kind of light that did not alter the night so much as deepen it, allowing the darkness to breathe without fear. As I walked, my gaze was drawn again and again to the silver track across the water, a road I could not take but could follow with my eyes until it dissolved at the far edge of the sea. The beach here was smooth, the sand damp and compact from the retreating tide. My bare feet pressed into its coolness, leaving shallow impressions that the next faint breeze would soften away. I walked without hurry, each step guided by the moon's reflection ahead, the water's voice a steady companion at my side. Now and then, a slightly larger wave would unfurl, spilling a thin lace of foam across the sand, where it lingered for a moment before slipping back, leaving behind a line of glistening wetness. The air was mild, touched by the ocean's salt, and carried the faintest coolness from the open water. When I turned my head toward the sea, the moonlight brushed my face, and I could almost feel its texture, smooth and weightless, like silk drifting through my thoughts. Overhead, the sky was vast and open, scattered with a few quiet stars, their faint light blending into the moon's greater glow. I found myself slowing more with each step, as if the night itself had taken hold of my pace and was easing it to match its own rhythm. The sound of the waves, crest, hush, retreat, pause, began to seem not separate from my movements, but woven into them. The moon's reflection on the water shifted with every ripple, breaking and reforming like something alive, yet completely at peace. I thought about how many nights the moon had risen over this same stretch of sea, and how many others it had watched from other shores, cold northern coasts where ice drifted under its gaze, tropical bays where palms swayed in the warm air, harbors where ships rocked at anchor. The moon had been there for each one, unchanged and unhurried, a silent witness to the turning of tides and the slow passage of time. It struck me that it must have looked down on nights like this for as long as there had been eyes to look back at it, and on countless nights before that, when only the water and wind shared its company. It had watched entire lives pass, entire generations come and go, without ever breaking its silent vigil. That thought brought with it a strange kind of comfort, the way one feels knowing a lighthouse will still be shining long after you have walked away from the shore. The path of moonlight across the waves shifted as I moved, yet it always seemed to meet me wherever I went. Sometimes it stretched wide and scattered, the silver scattering into smaller glimmers. Other times, it narrowed to a single bright ribbon that led straight toward the horizon. I followed it as I walked, not because it would take me anywhere in particular, but because it seemed to want me to. Here and there, small pools of water lay in depressions on the sand, left behind by the tide. They mirrored the moon so perfectly that I found myself pausing to look into them, as though each was a tiny, self-contained night sky. The surface would tremble slightly when the breeze passed over, breaking the image into a dozen silvery fragments before letting it settle again. Farther along, the sound of the ocean shifted, still gentle, but with a deeper undertone, as though the seabed here shaped the waves differently. I could hear a low hum beneath the splash and retreat, almost like a quiet chord held in the background of the night. The moonlight caught the tops of each wave, making them seem like slow-moving threads of silver, weaving themselves into the darker fabric of the sea. I breathed in deeply, filling my lungs with the salt air, and let it go in a long, unbroken sigh. There was no urgency here, no destination to reach. The night unfolded at its own pace, and I could either match it or be carried along. I let my thoughts drift without direction, the way foam drifts across the surface before being drawn back to the depths. Somewhere far out beyond the silver path, the sea darkened into its true depths, a place the moonlight could not touch. But here, at the water's edge, I felt as though I were standing in the meeting place of two worlds, the grounded quiet of the sand beneath me and the restless, shining expanse before me. The waves continued their endless arrival and departure, and the moon, patient as ever, looked on. I imagined it would still be here long after I had left, watching over the tide as it had done for centuries, lighting the way for anyone else who found themselves walking along the shore at this hour. I walked on, the moonlight guiding me without force, the sea breathing steadily at my side, and the night deepening in the spaces between my footsteps. Each moment seemed to carry a little more stillness than the last, as though the whole world were leaning slowly toward rest. The shoreline curved gently inward, as if the land itself had drawn a soft breath and held it. Here, the sea was quieter, its voice reduced to a murmur, as though it had nothing urgent to say. The waves arrived without haste, their edges folding neatly over one another before they met the sand. They lingered for a moment, barely covering the pebbles at the water's edge, and then retreated, leaving behind a faint shimmer in the moonlight. I stepped into this small cove as though crossing into another room. The air slightly different here, the rhythm slower, The arc of the land on either side created a kind of shelter, muffling the sounds from the open shore. What reached me now was not the long breath of the ocean's expanse, but a closer, more intimate whisper. The sound of water brushing against stone, of foam loosening its hold on the sand. A broad, flat stone rested near the waterline, its surface worn smooth by years of tides and weather. I lowered myself onto it, crossing my legs and letting my hands rest loosely in my lap. The stone's coolness seeped through the thin fabric of my clothing, grounding me, making me aware of my body's weight and stillness. Beneath me, it felt steady and ancient, as if it had been waiting here for a very long time for someone to sit and listen. The cove smelled faintly of salt and something softer, like damp earth after a gentle rain. A trace of seaweed drifted on the breeze, but it was mild, blending into the air rather than standing apart. Somewhere far above, the moonlight spilled into this hollow, pooling on the water's surface in pale fragments. I followed its reflection as it shifted and scattered with each subtle movement of the tide. The longer I sat, the more the edges of my thoughts began to loosen. At first, they still wandered, recalling the long walk along the shore, the way the moon had climbed into the sky. But slowly, they began to dissolve into sensations. The coolness of the stone beneath me, the faint dampness in the air resting on my skin, the low, even hum of the water moving in and out of the cove. Every sound seemed to have softened. Even the small pebbles, shifting under the water's touch, moved with a muted click, as though muffled by layers of time. The breeze carried no rush or gust, only a slow drift that passed over me without urgency. I became aware of my breathing, steady, almost in rhythm with the tide. Inhaling felt like drawing in the moonlit air, exhaling like releasing it back to the sea. The cove seemed untouched by anything beyond its curve. No voices, no distant calls of gulls, no hollow boom of larger waves breaking farther down the coast. Only this sheltered, whispered conversation between water and stone. I let my eyes half close, not in sleep yet, but in a kind of waking rest, where the world became softer without disappearing. In this light, the sea was neither blue nor black, but something in between, a color that belonged only to night. The foam patterns formed and dissolved so gently that it was impossible to say when one ended and the next began. I found that the longer I watched, the slower time seemed to move. The moments between waves lengthened, or perhaps it was that my own sense of pace was changing. I no longer felt the need to measure how long I had been sitting or how far I had come along the shore. I was simply here, and here was enough. My fingers traced the surface of the stone absently, following its smoothness to where it dipped slightly toward the sand. It was cool at first, but the warmth of my hand lingered for a moment after I lifted it. Small grains of sand clung to my fingertips, their texture a reminder of the shore, even in this stillness. When I looked out again, The cove seemed almost like a bowl, cradling a piece of the ocean, not holding it still, but slowing it, letting it rest before it returned to the greater tide. The water here didn't rush to meet the shore. It arrived as though it already knew it belonged and would be welcomed back each time it came. The thought drifted away as soon as it came, replaced by the feel of the night air moving gently through my hair. Somewhere far off, a faint swell rose and fell, but by the time it reached this curve in the land, it had quieted into a soft breath. I imagined the entire ocean breathing in this way, slow, deep, endless. I sat for a long while without counting the moments, letting the cove's quietness become part of me. The rhythm of my thoughts matched the water's approach and retreat, each one arriving gently, lingering briefly, then fading away. I knew that eventually I would stand and continue along the shore, but there was no need to think about that now. The night was still wide and unbroken, and the sea's whisper would be here for as long as I wished to listen. For now, I simply sat, breathing with the tide, feeling the stones stia. The sand at the edge of the cove was scattered with small treasures, left behind by the tide as it had slipped quietly away. In the soft moonlight, they seemed to glow in muted tones, pale shapes resting against the darker grains of damp sand. I let my gaze wander over them without hurry, each one inviting a closer look. A length of driftwood lay just within reach, its form long and slender, like a piece of bone smoothed by time. I lifted it gently, feeling the surface under my fingertips. It was polished to a satin finish by years of waves tumbling it over sand and stone. No edges remained, only gentle curves that flowed from one end to the other. Its pale color held the faintest tint of silver in this light, as if it still remembered the moonlit waters it had once floated through. I traced the length of it slowly, imagining the journey it must have taken. Perhaps it had broken from some faraway shore, traveled across restless waters, spent seasons drifting without direction. Each roll in the surf, each long exposure to salt and sun and wind had shaped it into what it was now. Light, smooth, and quiet. Nearby, a small cluster of shells rested in the sand. I knelt to see them more closely, brushing away a fine layer of grit with the back of my hand. One was the shape of a perfect spiral, its surface lined with delicate ridges that caught tiny shadows. Another was flatter, like a thin coin, with soft pink blushes still visible along the edges. A third was chipped, the inner layers revealed in a soft curve of white and cream. I picked one up, turning it in my palm. Inside, a few grains of sand had settled, and they shifted with a faint, dry whisper when I moved it. The sound was small, but it felt as though it belonged entirely to the shoreline, a reminder that even something as simple as a shell held traces of the sea's voice. Each piece I touched seemed to carry a memory, not the kind that could be put into words, but one felt quietly deep in the body. The driftwood remembered the pull and push of currents, The shells remembered the creatures that had once lived within them, the long hours of being shaped by waves. They had been part of the ocean, and even now, lying here in the stillness of night, they were not separate from it. I let the shells slip back into the sand where I had found them, leaving the arrangement undisturbed. There was something comforting about knowing they would remain here until the next tide decided to move them. I reached for another piece of driftwood, shorter and thicker than the first. It was worn to a gentle oval, the grain faint, but visible in pale lines running the length of it. Holding it was like holding a piece of the sea's patience, the kind of patience that works over years and decades, wearing away what is sharp until only smoothness remains. As I moved slowly along the edge of the cove, I found more of these quiet relics. Some shells were no larger than my fingertip, their details so fine I had to lean close to see them clearly. Others were broad and strong, edges softened by sand, but still holding their shape. Now and then, I saw a piece that shimmered faintly, the inside catching the moonlight in a muted iridescence, like light underwater. I realized, as I touched them, that I felt almost like one of them, something shaped by time and tides. My own edges over the years had been softened by experiences, by days and nights that had passed in their own quiet rhythm. Standing here, among driftwood and shells, I felt less like a visitor to this place and more like a part of it, as if the shoreline and I shared something unspoken. I crouched again, letting my fingers sift through the damp sand. Grains slipped easily between them, cool and fine, leaving faint traces on my skin. Here and there, my fingertips caught against the edge of something harder, a fragment of shell, a small stone polished by waves. I gathered a few into my palm and studied them in the moonlight. Together, they looked like a small collection of moments, each different, but linked by the place they had come from. The night air was gentle, brushing against my face and carrying the faint scent of salt and something distant, perhaps the sweetness of unseen flowers carried down from the dunes. Above, the moon hung steady, its light touching everything equally: the sea, the sand, the driftwood, the shells, and me. There was no sense of separation, only the quiet certainty that all of it belonged to the same slow, endless rhythm. I let the pieces in my hand fall softly back to the sand, watching how they landed. Some nestled into the grains without a sound. Others tipped slightly, catching a glint of light before settling. I wondered how many more such objects lay just beneath the surface, waiting for the tide, or the wind, or an unhurried step to bring them into view. I stayed there for a while longer, moving slowly, letting my hands and eyes wander from one small discovery to the next. Time seemed to lose its shape, becoming as fluid as the water nearby. Each shell, each piece of driftwood, each handful of sand felt like part of the same quiet conversation, one that had been going on for centuries. In every cove and on every shore, long before I had arrived. When I finally straightened, I kept my hands loose at my sides, feeling the faint residue of sand on my fingertips. The cove was still and unchanged, Yet I felt as though something within me had settled further into calm. I breathed in the cool air, let it out slowly, and listened once more to the soft, patient voice of the sea. I lowered myself onto the sand with unhurried movements, feeling the slight give beneath me as the grains shifted to cradle my weight. Stretching out, I crossed my hands behind my head, letting my elbows open wide, and allowed my gaze to drift toward the sky. The curve of it seemed vast and endless, the darkness deepening gently, the stars scattered like quiet thoughts that had chosen to stay a while. I half closed my eyes, letting my lashes blur the view until the heavens and sea became one soft expanse. The steady sound of the water reached me from only a short distance away. The long exhale of a wave, the pause, the faint hush as it retreated. Then again, another breath and another, as if the ocean and I were breathing together. I noticed, without forcing it, how my own rhythm began to match its slow pulse. My chest rose as the waves drew near and fell as they slid back into themselves. The joining of the two, my breath and the seas, felt like a conversation without words, as if the water were teaching me a language I already knew but had forgotten until now. The air carried the scent of seaweed, faint yet earthy, reminding me that the ocean had a life far beyond what I could see. Somewhere just out of sight, it was stirring in deep green tangles, swaying in unseen currents. The smell was grounding, connecting this place to the depths from which it came. Every so often, the breeze shifted, carrying with it a light spray, just enough to touch my cheeks and forehead. It felt like the gentlest of kisses, cool and fleeting, as though the ocean had reached out to remind me of its nearness. The salt lingered faintly on my skin, drying quickly, but leaving a memory in the form of a slight, pleasant tightness. I let my arms relax further, sinking my shoulders into the sand. It felt cool beneath me, not in a way that chilled, but in a way that soothed, as if the ground itself held the calm of night. Each grain pressed lightly against my back and legs, creating 1,000 small points of contact, almost like the embrace of still water. Above me, clouds drifted slowly across the sky, loose, gray shapes that moved so quietly they seemed not to disturb the air at all. Through them, the moonlight poured in soft silver, touching the waves so they shone with a dim, shifting glow. It was a light that did not demand attention, but one that invited it, drawing the eyes into its quiet beauty. Somewhere to my right, a cluster of dune grass rustled in the wind, their stalks brushing against each other in a rhythm too delicate to measure. The sound blended seamlessly with the ocean's own voice, until it was impossible to tell where one ended and the other began. I realized my thoughts had begun to wander in slow, aimless loops, like the foam that drifts lazily on a calm tide. They moved without urgency, touching on images and memories without ever holding them tightly. A fragment of a past evening, the face of a stranger glimpsed once, the feel of rain on warm skin. Each would appear for a moment, then dissolve into the same dark, soft current. The more I lay there, the more the edges of myself seemed to blur. My breathing no longer felt separate from the oceans. My stillness was part of the stillness of the shore. Even the faint sounds, the distant cry of a gull, the occasional shift of pebbles as the tide moved them, seemed not to come from outside, but from within the same quiet space I occupied. I could feel the pull of the tide in my body, a deep and slow rhythm beneath my heartbeat. It was not something I tried to hold on to, just something I allowed to be there, steady and constant, like the way the earth turns beneath the night. The sand supported me so fully that it was as though I were lying on the surface of the water itself, floating without effort. The thought drifted through me, light as the breeze, and I let it pass without needing to shape it further. The scent of the sea, the coolness of the night air, the silver wash of moonlight, the pulse of the waves. All of it folded around me until I could no longer tell where the shore ended and I began. Somewhere deep within, a quietness grew, like the hush that settles over a room after the last candle is blown out. My eyelids lowered fully now, the darkness behind them filled with the soft shimmer of imagined light. The ocean's voice was still there, patient and steady, and I let it carry me deeper into stillness, each breath slower than the last. Time no longer seemed to move forward or backward. There was only this, the sand beneath me, the sky above, the water's breath beside me, and my own breathing folding into it. The boundary between waking and dreaming thinned until I was drifting in a place where they felt almost the same. And in that space, I rested. Not because I had chosen to, but because the night had opened its arms and I had simply stepped inside. The night had settled fully now, its quiet presence stretching from horizon to horizon. Above me, the stars had multiplied until they seemed too many to count. Not just a sprinkling, but whole rivers and clusters of them flowing through the dark. They hung in the air like ancient lanterns, each one steady and small, yet together forming something endless. Some of them shimmered so brightly that their reflections appeared on the ocean's skin, trembling faintly as the waves moved beneath them. It was as though the sky had lowered itself onto the water, and the two had become a single, breathing thing. The faint line where they met seemed to vanish entirely when I softened my gaze, leaving only a wide, seamless expanse of deep blue and silver light. I found myself watching the stars closest to the horizon, where the water's surface caught them just enough to double their glow. Every crest of a wave seemed to cradle them for a moment before letting them slip back into the dark. It felt like a secret exchange, the sea borrowing the stars for a heartbeat, then returning them to the sky. The longer I looked, the more the stars seemed to move. Not in any hurried way, but with the slow drift of the earth turning beneath me. I could almost feel it, that quiet, constant rotation, carrying me gently through the night, Without meaning to, I thought of nights long ago, lying in the grass on warm summer evenings, staring at constellations with a child's unshaped wonder. I remembered tracing invisible lines between them, giving them shapes and names, thinking they belonged to me in some way. But I didn't let the memory pull me away. I kept myself anchored here, in this moment, letting the past be like a faint. The ocean's sound remained constant, low and rhythmic, as if it too were keeping time with the slow dance of the stars. Every rise and fall of its voice seemed to echo in the stillness above, a bridge between water and sky. A cool breath of wind passed over me, carrying the faint, clean scent of salt. It felt like the night itself had leaned down to speak softly in my ear. I pulled that sensation inward, letting it fill me until my own breathing matched its pace, deep, slow, and breathless, and easy. The stars overhead did not flicker in haste. They pulsed softly, like living embers in a great, dark hearth. And the sea, restless but calm, seemed to tend them, rocking their light, weaving it into its surface, sending it outward in gentle waves. Somewhere far beyond sight, the moon still lingered, though I could not see it from where. The thought was strangely comforting, that this view, this merging of ocean and sky, was not mine alone, but had been witnessed by countless eyes before me. Sailors at sea, travelers on distant shores, even those who had stood here long before I ever arrived. All had seen the same quiet beauty, felt the same steady pull of its calm. I let my eyes wander slowly from one constellation to another, not searching for meaning, only resting in the act of looking. Each star became a point of stillness, a soft light to guide my attention outward and inward at the same time. Somewhere near the horizon, a faint streak of light moved briefly across the dark, a falling star, disappearing almost as soon as I noticed it. There was no urge to make a wish, only a quiet acceptance that it had come and gone. Like so many small moments in life, the night felt boundless, yet gentle. It was not the vastness of something overwhelming, but the vastness of something safe, like being held within a space too wide to measure, yet knowing you could drift forever without losing your way. I closed my eyes for a moment, and the stars remained behind my eyelids as a soft afterimage. I could almost feel them as a weightless presence above me, as if their light were pressing down in the most delicate way, settling over my skin like the thinnest of blankets. When I opened my eyes again, the horizon had grown darker, and the stars seemed even brighter against it. The reflection of their light on the water was steadier now, the wind gentler, the waves slower. It was as if the whole night had taken a deep breath and was now exhaling into stillness. I let that stillness seep into me. My body felt heavier where it met the sand, more deeply rooted, yet my mind floated with the stars and their mirrored selves on the water. The two, grounded and drifting, did not feel separate. But part of the line between the ocean and the sky had vanished entirely now. There was only one vast, gentle infinity surrounding me, carrying me forward without motion, holding me without touch. And in that wide, unbroken space, I simply breathed. The stars above, the water below, and my own heart somewhere in between, moving as slowly as the night itself. The horizon had dissolved into something soft and seamless, so that I could no longer tell where the water ended and the sky began. It was as if the night had taken a careful brush and blended the two together until all that remained was a single unbroken tone, a slow, endless fade from the deep indigo of the sea to the velvety black of the heavens. No hard lines, no boundaries, only the gentlest shift of shade, as if both water and air belonged to the same quiet body. I found myself gazing toward that meeting place, though I knew it wasn't truly there. Horizons are not things one can touch or step across. They are like dreams, always just beyond reach, drawing the eyes forward even when the feet remain still. I thought about how we move toward them without ever arriving, how the horizon walks with us, keeping its soft distance, guiding without urgency. The more I looked, the more it seemed that I was traveling without moving. The sand beneath me did not change. The tide rolled in and out in its steady rhythm, and yet the world shifted around me in the slow turning of the night. The stars inched along their silent paths, the color of the water deepened, and the horizon, that quiet, imagined line, moved as gently as breath. It felt a little like floating, not drifting away, but suspended in place, as if I had become part of the space between sea and sky. The air touched my skin with the lightest of hands, carrying a faint coolness that slicked into my lungs with every breath. I inhaled the scent of salt and faint seaweed, of something green and alive, hidden just out of sight. Each breath seemed to lengthen, to slow, to match the world's own unhurried pace. The soundscape around me had narrowed to only the most delicate voices of the night. The tide, patient and measured, came and went with the same soft certainty it had carried for centuries. A breeze whispered through unseen grass, shifting just enough to let me know it was there. Somewhere further inland, faint and irregular, came the tiny, chiming calls of night insects, each one a small note in an otherwise endless chord of quiet. The absence of all else made these sounds feel more intimate, more present. I could hear the small spaces between the waves, the moment when the wind paused before beginning again, the hush that followed each insect's call. It was like listening to a lullaby that had no beginning and no end. The horizon seemed to pulse in its own way, not moving quickly, but subtly changing, as though the deepening night were a slow tide in the sky itself. The stars near that invisible meeting line shimmered faintly, and their reflections swayed with the movement of the water. I let my eyes rest there, watching until the boundary between looking outward and looking inward seemed to disappear. It occurred to me that the horizon is less a destination and more a companion. It walks beside us in our waking hours and our sleeping dreams, following our gaze, sharing the same quiet patience as the moon and the tide. In some way, it holds everything together. The weight of the earth beneath us, the endless sky above, the water that stretches in between. I let the thought drift away like a shell carried back into the sea, and I stayed with the feeling instead. A calm that had no edges, no urgency, no shape except for the slow arc of the night's passing. The longer I sat there, the more I felt myself becoming part of the stillness, as if the horizon and I were both made from the same soft line. Even with my eyes closed, I could feel its presence. It was there, in the even hush of the waves, in the tender sweep of wind against my cheek, in the faint vibration of the earth beneath me. It was there, in the sense of balance, the way sea and sky leaned toward each other, neither pressing nor pulling, simply existing together. When I opened my eyes again, nothing had changed, yet everything felt deeper. The colors were darker, richer, the stars a little brighter, the air a touch cooler, and still, the horizon remained what it always had been, untouchable, steady, quietly keeping its distance, yet somehow drawing me closer into its peace. The tide sighed, the wind turned, and the insects sang again, and I stayed there in the space between, not arriving anywhere, not needing to, just breathing in the quiet until it became part of me. The dune rose only gently from the shoreline, its curves soft and rounded, as though it had been shaped not by force, but by years of patient wind and tide. I climbed it slowly, each step pressing into sand that shifted under my weight, giving just enough to remind me of its softness. When I reached the crest, the air seemed calmer, the steady ocean breeze dimmed to a faint breath. I settled into the hollowed side of the dune, where the wind could not reach me. Here, the sand still held the memory of the day's warmth. It radiated upward into my palms, into the soles of my feet, and into the fabric of my clothes. The heat was not strong, but gentle, like the last fading notes of a song, lingering in the air long after the music has ended. I let my body sink into it, as if the dune itself had opened its arms to hold me. Around me, tall strands of dune grass leaned and swayed in a slow, unhurried dance. Their movement created the faintest rustle, a dry, whispering sound that rose and fell in time with the wind. It was not unlike the sound of turning pages in a book read long ago, a quiet memory speaking just at the edge of hearing. Together with the distant murmur of the tide, the grass composed its own lullaby. I closed my eyes for a moment, not to sleep, but simply to feel the night without the distraction of sight. With my vision resting, the other senses seemed to stretch and awaken. The deep salt of the ocean on the air, the warmth of sand beneath me, balanced by a cooler breeze against my cheek. The layered soundscape of grass, wind, and water weaving themselves together. Time loosened its grip, and I drifted in that space where minutes have no edges, When I opened my eyes again, the world seemed silvered. Moonlight spilled across the shore. Its pale glow from this sheltered place. I could see how the moon painted the world in shades that only existed after dark. Deep blue shadows, soft gray slopes, the faint gleam of shell or stone half buried in the sand. Even the grass nearby shimmered faintly, each blade catching a thread of silver as it bent in the wind. The dune cradled me, and I imagined it had been here for centuries, watching over countless such nights. Perhaps others had rested in this same place, letting the sand hold them while the ocean sang below. The thought comforted me that I was part of a quiet lineage of wanderers and dreamers who had paused here in the arms of the dune, breathing in the same soft air. The warmth beneath me began to soften, fading slowly as the night deepened, but its memory stayed. I let my fingers drift lazily through the sand beside me, feeling the way it trickled and shifted, how each grain caught a tiny spark of moonlight before settling. It was as though the dune were reminding me that stillness, too, could be a kind of movement. I leaned back against the slope, letting my head rest, my gaze lingering on the shore below. The tide was patient, drawing its lacework of foam along the beach in unending patterns. The water never rushed, never faltered. It simply came and went, as it always had, as it always would, without need for hurry or change. In that moment, I felt the same, part of a rhythm far larger than myself, moving without effort, belonging entirely to the night. The dune's embrace was steady around me. The grass continued its soft chorus, and the moon kept watch over all. I breathed deeply, slowly, and allowed myself to sink further into that shelter, knowing there was nowhere else to be. It began so subtly that at first I thought it was only my own thoughts rearranging themselves into softer shapes. The ocean's voice was always there, in one form or another. The rise and fall of the tide, the hushed sigh as water curled over the sand, the faint fizz of foam dissolving. But tonight, wrapped in the quiet arms of the dune, I started to hear something deeper. It wasn't language as we usually know it. There were no distinct words, no sharp edges to the sounds. It was slower, more fluid, like something spoken in a dream, where meaning does not arrive through syllables, but through the space between them. Each wave seemed to lean toward the shore with. The pattern was constant, yet never the same. A long, slow approach, a low rush, almost a hum, then a trailing whisper as the water drew back, carrying some secret into the darkness. I couldn't catch any single phrase, but I felt what it meant. A quiet reassurance that there was no need to rush, that everything had its own gentle timing. It was as if the ocean was telling me, rest, breathe, be still. The words weren't spoken, yet I understood them the way in this rhythm. Time seemed to dissolve. There was no longer a before or after, only this slow pulse, steady and certain. The ocean was older than any thought I could hold in my head, and yet in this moment, It felt close, almost familiar, like an old friend whose presence alone was enough to quiet the mind. The night air cooled against my skin, carrying the briny scent of seaweed and salt, mingled with something faintly sweet from flowers hidden in the dunes. My senses settled into this blend of textures and sounds. The grainy warmth of the sand beneath my palms, the distant hiss of water meeting stone farther down the shore, the soft rustle of dune grass leaning toward the sea. I let the imagined voice wash through me. If the ocean had a language, perhaps it was one of patience, a reminder that the shore will always wait, that the tide will always return. It did not try to convince or persuade. It only offered its truth, again and again, in an endless, tender repetition. Some waves came gently, no more than a sigh sliding over the sand, while others brought a fuller, deeper rush, like a slow breath drawn from the depths. Between them, the pauses felt rich, like the silence between heartbeats, still but alive. I realized I no longer felt the need to think about where I was going or what I was doing. The ocean seemed to know enough for both of us. I only needed to listen. The more I listened, the less I felt like a separate thing from the water, the sand, the air. My thoughts loosened, untied from the day's usual knots, drifting out like tiny boats into the dark horizon. The voice of the ocean moved through me as naturally as the tide itself. And with each passing minute, I sank deeper into its cadence. I closed my eyes again, and though I could no longer see the moonlight glittering on the surface, I felt its presence in the cool silver of the air. Behind my eyelids, the waves continued, a long approach, a breath, a whisper, and then the gentle retreat, over and over, like a lullaby, without beginning or end. My body felt heavier now, not in weariness, but in the way a stone is heavy, grounded, settled, unmoving. Even the wind seemed to slow, as if it too were listening for the next soft syllable from the sea. The ocean spoke on, not in words, but in the language of endless patience, and I, breathing with it, let myself dissolve into that conversation. There was nothing to reply, nothing to decide, nothing to do but drift with the whisper until I could no longer tell where the sound ended and my own stillness began. The moonlight lay across the water like a sheet of pale silk, shifting and folding with every slow movement of the tide. I watched as each ripple bent the light into new shapes, some slender and silver, some broad and softly blurred, all of them dissolving before they could be remembered. It was an endless painting, made and remade in the span of a breath. The shadows moved with equal gentleness, curling around the waves like the quiet patterns at the bottom of a shallow stream. They slid over one another, never clashing, never hurrying, as if they had all the time in the world. And perhaps they did. The moon's touch was patient, and the water welcomed it without resistance. There was something hypnotic in the way the light drifted. My gaze followed it without thought, tracing the rise and fall of those glowing bands as they stretched toward me, then pulled away again. Each wave was like a slow inhale and exhale, and somewhere within me, my own breathing fell into step with it, until I could no longer tell which rhythm had started first. Mine or the sea's? The more I watched, the less I felt the need to name or describe what I was seeing. The patterns didn't ask to be understood. They asked only to be witnessed. The longer I looked, the more my thoughts began to loosen, slipping from their edges like shells sinking back into the sand. The hours, if they were passing at all, did so without my notice. The moon rose higher, its reflection stretching across the water in a trembling pathway of silver. Sometimes it seemed close enough to step upon, as though I could walk out along that shining bridge until I reached the horizon. But even that thought faded quickly, dissolving into the slow sway of light and shadow. The night air was cool and tasted faintly of salt, each breath deepening the quiet inside me. Somewhere beyond my awareness, the world might still have been moving. Stars drifting overhead, tides shaping distant shores. But here, in this small space between the dunes and the sea, there was no need for anything but stillness. Light shimmered, shadows curled, waves rose and fell. My mind, no longer tangled in the lines of past or future, lay open and calm, like a tide pool untouched by wind. There was no before, no after, only the soft now, stretching on like the ocean itself, unbroken, without end. It felt as though the water and I shared the same slow pulse, the same patient breath. And in that rhythm, in that endless, quiet repetition, I found a stillness deep enough to rest with it. Far out along the horizon, where the water met the sky in that seamless embrace, there was the softest bloom of something lighter. It wasn't yet morning, not even close. The night still held its dark, silken canopy, but the faintest suggestion of a paler shade had begun to hum at the very edge of vision. It was not a change that asked for attention, but one that settled into the senses like a distant memory returning. I felt no pull to name it or reach toward it. The night was whole and complete just as it was, and I remained folded into its quiet arms. Still, I noticed it, the way one notices a feather drifting through the air, not because it demands to be caught, but because it is simply there, moving at its own unhurried pace. The shoreline lay in a hush that seemed to belong more to dream than to waking. A veil of pale mist had gathered where the tide stretched itself across the sand, rising and falling with the sea's long breath. It curled lazily around the driftwood, softened the outlines of shells, blurred the edges of stones, until they seemed more like thoughts than things. Each inhalation felt as though it was drawn not just into my lungs, but into the very space around me. The coolness entered first, delicate and briny, carrying the faint trace of salt and the ghost of seaweed. Then came the weightless fullness that seemed to expand somewhere deep within my chest, before leaving again in a warm, slow exhale that joined the mist. I found myself breathing in time with the ocean, without even meaning to. Each rise and fall, stitched to its patient rhythm. The waves themselves seemed quieter now, as though the night had deepened into its most restful hour. The crests rolled in with a softened edge, breaking not in a splash, but in a sigh. The sound spread along the shore like the rustle of silk being drawn across a table, fading into the damp air before it could reach its end. I let my eyes wander upward. The stars still shimmered in their multitudes, though their brilliance had mellowed. Here and there, a few seemed to dim behind the faint wash of that faraway glow. It was like watching candlelight in a room where a curtain has been drawn back, just enough to let in the thinnest slip of dawn. Not enough to banish the dark, but enough to give it a gentler hue. There was no urgency in that pale presence. It was content to wait, just as I was. We shared that unspoken agreement. Nothing needed to happen yet. The night's slow current was still carrying me, and there was no reason to leave its flow. Somewhere beyond the mist, I could just make out the muted glimmer of wet sand reflecting the moon's silver touch. The air seemed thicker there, almost velvety, as if the shoreline itself were steeped in dreams. A small shell caught my eye, its curved surface collecting a drop of mist that slid down to vanish into the sand. That tiny movement felt as complete as the turning of the tide. Breath by breath, the stillness inside me deepened. Thoughts no longer came in sentences, but in shapes and textures. The cool press of damp air against my skin, the soft grit of sand beneath my fingertips, the faint hiss of the ocean's retreat. I could have stayed here endlessly, each moment folding into the next without edges or urgency. That faint glow on the horizon would grow one day, perhaps even soon. But for now, it was content to be nothing more than a promise. And I, too, was content to simply... I drew my knees toward me and settled deeper into the sand, letting my body find its own comfortable shape. The grains shifted with a faint, yielding sigh beneath me, as if the earth itself were making space for my rest. The sand was not cold now, but held the memory of the day's last warmth, a gentle, low heat that seemed to seep into my skin in slow waves, joining the rhythm of my breath. Around my shoulders, the soft weight of a light shawl draped like a quiet embrace. Its fabric brushed against my neck with each slight movement, carrying with it a whisper of warmth that belonged entirely to this moment. I pulled it closer, feeling how easily it matched the tender patience of the night. The sound of the ocean had taken on a quality that was neither near nor far, but everywhere. It was no longer just something I heard with my ears. It was a presence that wrapped around me, filling the spaces between my thoughts. The tide spoke in tones that rose and fell like the breathing of some vast, sleeping being. Each exhale rolling to shore, each inhale drawing the water back into itself. The rhythm was so steady, so certain, that my own breathing gave in and followed, the two of us moving as one. I stopped trying to follow any single sound. Instead, I let them merge. The hiss of foam dissolving into sand, the low hum of air brushing past the dune grass, the occasional, almost imperceptible creak of driftwood shifting in place. Together, they formed a kind of music, without beginning or the moonlight softened everything it touched, smoothing the edges of shells, stones, and the gentle curve of the shoreline. Even my own hands, resting loosely against the sand, seemed more like shapes than details, more a suggestion of form and something to examine. My eyes felt unhurried now, closing for a few breaths at a time, opening again to see the same calm shapes waiting for me. Between waking and sleeping, the world felt porous, as though the air itself was made of something lighter, something that could slip easily between my skin and my thoughts. The moments began to lose their boundaries. I could not tell where one ended and the next began. A wave would arrive, linger, and fade, and I could not say whether it was the same wave I had heard before or an entirely new one. Time had lost its edges. Somewhere in the blur between awareness and dreaming, I imagined the ocean speaking. Not in words, not in anything that could be repeated, but in a tone that held the weight of patience. It told me that nothing needed to be hurried, that everything had its turn. It spoke of deep water moving in silence, of moonlight passing over the surface like a hand smoothing a blanket. Its language was one of stillness, and I understood it without needing to translate. I shifted slightly, curling in more, letting my cheek rest against the sand's faint warmth. The shawl was a cocoon now, holding the heat of my own body close, keeping the night air gentle against my skin. The ground beneath me was not flat, but softly contoured, fitting itself to my shape, as if it had been waiting for me to lie here. With each breath, my body felt heavier, more anchored, as though the tide's pull was not only in the water, but also in my limbs, my thoughts, my pulse. I floated in that space where dreams begin to form like mist, delicate outlines, quiet colors, nothing urgent or loud. They would come and go as they pleased, drifting through the edges of my awareness, like the clouds that sometimes wandered across the moon. The night folded around me without effort, the way a quiet room folds around the sleeper within it. I did not feel apart from it anymore. I was not a visitor at the shore. I was part of the shore itself, part of the slow rhythm, the patient breathing, the endless hush. Somewhere far down the beach, another wave began its long approach. I let my breath join it, and by the time it reached the shore, I was already adrift. Neither fully here nor fully gone, but somewhere in between, folded into the night. The tide had become the only measure of time I could feel. Each slow arrival, a gentle breath in. Each quiet retreat, a long contented sigh. My own breathing matched it so perfectly that I could no longer tell which rhythm had begun first, as if one had been folded into the other until they were indistinguishable. The shapes of the shoreline, once clear in the silver wash of moonlight, had grown softer, their edges dissolving into the dark. The dune grass no longer stood as individual blades, but as a single swaying shadow. The curve of the water was less a line than a quiet meeting of two shades, one deep, one pale, melting into each other without a seam. Even the sounds, so distinct when the night began, had settled into a distant, tender hum. The small variations, the foam's fizz, the soft rustle of the grass, the occasional low groan of water curling around a stone, had blended into something whole and unbroken, like a single note held indefinitely. It was everywhere at once, surrounding me, seeping into the spaces between my breaths. My thoughts no longer arrived as sentences. They moved like clouds, loose, unshaped, without edges to hold them in place. They floated into my awareness and away again, without asking for my attention. Some were no more than impressions. The memory of light across water, the feel of sand between my fingers, the scent of salt in cool air. But even these slipped apart as soon as I noticed them, dispersing into the wider quiet. I could feel my body surrendering, every muscle softening, as though it had been waiting for this exact stillness. My hands lay open against the sand, palms warm from where they had rested. My shoulders sank into the ground as if the earth was rising to hold them. Even my eyelids felt heavy in the way that wasn't tiredness, but a kind of peaceful inevitability. The deep pull of drowsiness came not as a sudden wave, but as a tide that had been rising all along, finally reaching me fully. It was warm, steady, and endlessly patient. It didn't rush or demand. It simply covered me the way the ocean covers the shore. A little more with each breath until there was no distinction between where I ended and where it began. I let my awareness drift outward, touching briefly on the shimmer of the moon over water, the cool trace of night air across my cheek, the weight of the shawl gathered at my neck. Each sensation lingered for only a moment before dissolving, slipping back into the dark, like a pebble sinking beneath the tide. Somewhere beyond the edges of thought, the ocean continued its endless breathing. I didn't need to listen for it anymore. It was in my chest, in my pulse, in the quiet rhythm that was carrying me into sleep. The last clear shapes of the world, the curve of the dune, the long silver path of moonlight, the gentle slope of the water, began to blur entirely, until I could no longer tell if my eyes were closed or open. Everything was soft now. The sand, the sky, the space inside my head. And as the final threads of thought unwound, I felt myself becoming as quiet and weightless as the clouds drifting unseen above the sea. The night had me, and I let it keep me. There was no more walking, no more shifting of limbs or gentle adjustments in the sand. My body had found its shape for the night, curled into itself, with the soft weight of rest settling over every inch. The shawl lay like a second skin, holding the warmth gathered from the day, and beneath me, the sand was a quiet cradle, molding itself around me in patient support. The ocean's voice no longer reached me as a thing apart, but as something so deeply woven into the air that I could not separate it from the stillness inside. It was not loud or soft, near or far. It was simply there, an endless exhale that had no beginning and no end. I felt its rhythm inside my chest, in the slow lift and fall, that came without effort, without thought. My own breathing became the simplest, most natural thing in the world. Each inhale gathering a trace of coolness, each exhale dissolving into the warm night. Even the pauses between breaths grew longer, as though they too had grown drowsy. I could feel the space between thoughts widening in the same way, little pools of silence where nothing needed to be formed or understood. I spoke to myself in the quietest way, almost without words, just impressions. The feeling of air across my face, the soft pressure of sand at my back, the slow sway of the tide inside my awareness. My voice, if it could still be called a voice, moved more slowly now, as though each thought floated a while before drifting toward the next. Time no longer stacked itself in minutes or hours. It was a slow, silver drift. I could not tell if I had been lying here for a few moments or all night. The moonlight was steady, but my sense of it shifted, growing softer, less distinct, until it became more a presence than a sight. There was no desire to hold on to anything, no image, no sound, no memory. Everything came and went in its own time, passing gently through the quiet. The world beyond this small place had faded completely, leaving only the dark curve of the shore, the water breathing against it, and the weight of my body surrendering more deeply to the sand. Even inside my mind, the voice I carried had thinned to a whisper. It was no longer telling the story of the night. It was simply part of the night itself, trailing away between the pauses, until the pauses became everything. The spaces between words opened wider, like a tide pulling slowly back, revealing nothing but stillness beneath. And then there was no more telling, no more thinking about telling, only calm, only the hush that had been here all along, waiting for me to arrive and rest within it. The ocean went on speaking, but I no longer listened for meaning. Its sound was as steady as my breathing, as unbroken as the sky, the warmth of my shawl, the cool scent of salt, the deep softness of the sand. They all seemed to breathe with me, and then for me, until I could not tell where I ended and they began. In that quiet, the story I had been carrying dissolved completely. There was no ending, only this, a stillness so deep it held everything. A night without edges, an ocean without horizon, a breath without beginning or end. And into that stillness, I drifted.